All right, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us. My name is Patrick Fife. I am the Associate General Counsel here at LIBOR, and I am thrilled that I have the pleasure and honor of welcoming Bryan Greene today. Bryan is NAR's Vice President of Political Advocacy, and he's coming back to LIBOR. He's been here before. He was here back in, I think, June of 2020 for a webinar. When he was last year, our CEO, Tessa Holtz, who was very sad, she got called away to a meeting today and can't be here to introduce Bryan, but she called Bryan a rock star of fair housing. Those were her words. And I think Bryan's extraordinary and diverse resume shows he's all of that and more. After earning his degree in government from Harvard, Bryan spent over 20 years working in government, including serving 10 years as the highest ranking career official in HUD's Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity, where he oversaw the policy direction and operational management of the 600-person office enforcing the nation's fair housing and anti-discrimination laws. In 2007, Bryan was the recipient of the Presidential Rank Award, the highest federal honor bestowed upon federal senior executives for outstanding service. He joined NAR in November of 2019 as its first director of fair housing policy, and spent his first year at NAR raising the association's profile in Washington and nationwide on all fair housing and policy related matters. He's now currently the Vice President of Political Advocacy for NAR. He oversees all legislative and regulatory advocacy on behalf of the association's members. And I'll say that's not the most impressive thing I know about Bryan's resume. I found out a little more about him in preparation for today's intro, and he is also an accomplished freelance writer. He's written many pieces about history, music, race, society, including serving a contributing writer for the Smithsonian Magazine. And I read a couple of his pieces, and they are very interesting. But he, adding to his rock star resume, I found out he is most recently became an award-winning movie producer. He was the consulting producer on a 2021 music documentary, Summer of Soul. It's a 2-hour film about the 1969 Harlem Cultural Festival. It was directed by Amir Questlove Thompson from The Roots. And I was very fascinated to learn more about it, about the festival. I don't know if Bryan's going to get into it, so I don't want to steal his thunder if he's going to speak a little bit about it, but it was a festival that actually drew over 300,000 people over 6 days, and it included performers such as Stevie Wonder, Gladys Knight and the Pips, and until release of this documentary, it remained a relatively obscure event in pop culture and history. The films received countless awards: Sundance Film Festival, Critics' Choice Documentary Awards. So just another, feather in Bryan's cap, and I guess what further makes him not only a rock star in fair housing, but now the movie industry. So with Bryan's background in fair housing and history, we are very excited to have him here to discuss the tremendous role that Dr. Martin Luther King played in effectively advancing the Fair Housing Act, which was signed into law 1 week after Dr. King was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. So with that, I thank Bryan for being here, and we're going to turn it over to him. Thank you, Bryan.
Thank you, Patrick. You've certainly read my file.
I told Tessa I would do my best to give you a very top-notch intro, and it's definitely well deserving. So thank you again for being here.
Hey, I appreciate it, and maybe I will weave in a little bit about Summer of Soul before I'm done today. Because it's from the same era that we're talking about. That concert in New York, in Harlem, was a year after Dr. King's assassination, and that tragic act was very much on people's minds. In fact, if you should see Summer of Soul, you'll learn that Jesse Jackson appeared on the stage actually as a conductor of an orchestra called the Bread Basket Orchestra. And there, as part of that orchestra, playing sax, was a good friend of Dr. King, who, along with Jesse Jackson, was present on the day that King was assassinated. So they actually talk about the King assassination from the stage of the Harlem Cultural Festival and the impact it was having on the country and the Black community in particular, and the fight they had to take on. And Jesse Jackson also brought up Mahalia Jackson, who was one of Dr. King's favorite performers, and she and Mavis Staples, who was from Chicago, where Jesse Jackson was from as well, and the two of them sung Dr. King's favorite song, "Oh Precious Lord." And so lots of resonance there with what we're talking about today. And so I mentioned Chicago, and let me start there in talking about Chicago 1966. Kill him is what the counter-protesters chanted when Dr. King brought his civil rights march to Chicago. There were thousands of people in the street, not only chanting "kill him," but actually trying to kill him, throwing bricks at Dr. King and those protesting with him. And what was Dr. King protesting in Chicago in 1966? Housing discrimination and housing segregation. And when we commemorate Dr. King, we often speak of his "I Have a Dream" speech on the nation's capital, in 1963. We often talk about his march from Selma to Montgomery for voting rights. But we don't talk enough, I don't believe, about his role in fighting for fair housing. And that is what he dedicated the final years of his life to, fighting for fair housing. And when I say they chanted "kill him," within 2 years of that march in Chicago, he was dead. And Dr. King himself described that time in Chicago as some of the most violent years of his life, that he feared more marching through the streets of Chicago than he ever did facing the batons and the attack dogs of the Southern police and sheriffs. So he spoke quite candidly and in depth about the deep segregation in the North and the racism that maintained it, the racism that formed it and maintained it. And so I actually want to sort of commend to you a particular interview with Dr. King where he actually speaks at length about these issues. And before we're done here today, I will go into the chat and paste that, maybe a half hour long or so. I think many of us have had great opportunities to see Dr. King's soaring speeches. It is fascinating to hear him sit for a long interview. And when you hear it, you just realize just how insightful he was about power dynamics in the United States, but just also how much he appreciated the moral power of nonviolent protest and what he also describes as the impracticality of violence, not just the immorality of violence, but the impracticality of violence. But I think even more fundamentally, just the way in which American society was shot through with racism and inequality. And the way in which he describes the issues in this particular interview from 1967 still resonates very much today. I'm going to quote a little bit from it while I talk here today. But before I get to that, let me just point out that when Dr. King came up to Chicago, he spent about 11 months living there. A lot of people don't realize that. He moved out to North Lawndale, which is on the west side of Chicago, and moved into an apartment building in what people would call the ghetto, and spent time there, and spent his time in Chicago just dramatizing how we have created segregated communities in the North. Going back to the Great Migration that Isabel Wilkerson has written so powerfully about, and how through violence and then through racially restrictive covenants, more violence, and redlining, and more violence, and discriminatory practices, we maintained what he called the ghetto, and how, as a result of nearly 100 years of these practices, or then probably about 50 or 60 years of those practices, we'd created in Chicago and really northern cities generally sort of two societies. And he described it quite compellingly as two societies, the mainstream society and another one with what he called slum jobs, slum housing, slum education, and how people sought to maintain that, and how many didn't even realize how they had created it. But he also talks about the politics in the country at the time, and how he had the support of many members of Congress and many senators when he was protesting down south, and how they objected to the extremism, the violence that was meted out at Black protesters, and just how starkly segregated or explicitly segregated the South was, with its signs and different lunch counters, and all of the apartheid characteristics that we had in the American South. But once the 1964 Civil Rights Act had passed, and those members and senators had voted for that, and he turned his attention to northern segregation and the systemic nature of that, he lost their support, that this was going too far, that people did not want to interfere with that. And if you were to look at some of the history of New York, where I'm from actually, New York City representatives and others were very keen to make sure that the 1964 Civil Rights Act dealt with more explicit segregation in education, not the de facto segregation that was the result of discriminatory housing practices. So this is what King decided to take on in the latter part of his life. And if you check out this interview, I wanted to quote from it, but I realized I could just quote the entire thing if I wanted. There was so much that I think is powerful that you really need to watch the whole thing. But I am going to read a short passage that I transcribed here, just to give you an idea of what Dr. King was talking about at the time. He said, "The other thing we must see at this time is that many of the people who supported us in Selma and Birmingham were outraged about the extremist behavior toward Negroes, but they were not at that moment, and they are not now, committed to genuine equality for Negroes. It's much easier to integrate a lunch counter than it is to guarantee an annual income, for instance, to get rid of poverty for Negroes and for all poor people. It's much easier to integrate a bus than it is to make genuine integration a reality, and quality education a reality in our schools. It's much easier to integrate even a public park than it is to get rid of slums. I think we are in a new era, a new phase of the struggle, where we have moved from a struggle for decency, which has characterized our struggle for 10 or 12 years, to a struggle for genuine equality. And this is where we are getting the resistance, because there was never any intention to go this far. People were reacting to Bull Connor and to Jim Clark rather than acting in good faith for the realization of genuine equality. So he goes on in that vein and in more descriptive terms, and he's being interviewed by a fellow. And when you just watch it, I as someone who's had to do a lot of TV interviews and testimony, I've just never seen anyone, both so adept at answering these questions and speaking on the issues that he wants to speak, and being quite candid about these issues as well. So it really is fascinating to watch and to realize just how deeply committed Dr. King was and how focused he was at that time on dealing specifically with housing segregation. And he talks about that specific issue in that interview. And we all know, and as Patrick pointed out, that the Fair Housing Act was effectively a memorial to Dr. King. The legislation that Dr. King advocated for, and that was being debated in the Senate for some time, only passed after Dr. King was assassinated. And we today certainly celebrate that we have this law, but I think King's words about our commitment to the law and the effectiveness of the law is the challenge that faces us today in 2022. No one knows that better than those of you who are LIBOR members, and the recent challenges we've seen out on Long Island. I just want to say that what you've faced in Long Island has been an opportunity for all of us throughout the country to look at the unfinished work that Dr. King fought for. And I want to give you a bit of a progress report on where we are in rededicating our attention to this work, but then also where I think we need to go if we're truly going to realize Dr. King's dream. So almost immediately after New York Newsday ran that Long Island Divided piece, we began to outline what we believe were the key characteristics of a strong fair housing program from the National Association of Realtors, and told you June 2020 a little bit about that. But to underscore it, many people had stressed the need for more and better training. And of course, if you were to look at Newsday's feature, they do highlight the fact that training on fair housing in New York State may have been inadequate. I underscored that training is just the start. It's an important foundation, and certainly we can do better training, and we see that we needed to do better training. But the best way to think of that is as the floor. And we have launched implicit bias training. We've launched another interactive simulation that focuses more attention on how discrimination occurs in actual transactions. And I can talk a little bit more about each of those. But let me just say, it was important to do that kind of training, but it is only the foundation. On top of that, I said, well, we need to look at our culture as an industry. And I think still this, in many respects, is the hardest work, because it's in that fuzzy space of what's in our minds, what are our intentions, how do we get at more systemic and elusive issues. Many of the issues about schools that came up in the Newsday video, there are issues that sometimes, depending on how they come up, may violate the law. In other ways, they may not. But those are sticky issues, but ones that we must look at, because I think they're ultimately going to be the warp and weft of how we move forward. So that is important work for us to do, and I explain a little bit of what we're doing in that space. But I said really at the summit of our efforts needs to be work on accountability, that something has to happen when people engage in discrimination. We have laws that have been on our books for 50 plus years. We must enforce them. And we must also make sure that the real estate specific laws, like real estate licensing laws, are strong throughout the country, so that when people in this profession, real estate, engage in discriminatory practices, they lose their license. Something happens. So we together put those different efforts in a package, an acronym we called ACT, for Accountability, Culture Change, and Training, and tacked an exclamation point to the end of that to stress that we are going to move. We're going to be active in responding to the discrimination that still occurs throughout the country. So I want to give you a sort of a status report on some of that, and I'm just going to start with the training. I mentioned the implicit bias training. So now all of you have seen the video that we posted to our website, which just gave you a taste of how implicit bias training works and how it can be applied to real estate. I know that in New York, there's been an active commitment to do implicit bias training. We've worked closely with the group that produced that video for our website, the Perception Institute, to develop a 3-hour curriculum, which now we are turning into classroom training throughout the country. And we've begun to train trainers, real estate, realtor member trainers, to do this training throughout the country. So we've made great progress there, and we've also required at NAR that all of our leaders for all of our committees also participate in such training. Fair Haven, I think everyone's familiar with the Fair Haven module that we launched. Rather than just do trainings where people stand in front of a class and tell you about the law, and nothing wrong with that, we thought we should go a step farther and create scenarios where that law is applied and where issues come up where you may recognize the law has been broken. And we thought this was a helpful way to internalize the fair housing laws. I found it very helpful. I've done fair housing work for 30 plus years, but the way I think I really exercise those muscles, those fair housing muscles, is when I'm confronted with new situations. And so having new situations created through this module is just very helpful for people to think about how discrimination can occur in a real life transaction. So that was a big step. And if you haven't done Fair Haven, please do it. And we've worked with a number of brokerages to bring Fair Haven in-house as well, so that they can have their agents trained. So as I said, training was just the foundation, the floor. On culture, we said, all right, well, it's very important that we model fair housing, that we identify people in our industry who can speak to other people in our industry just about the value of fair housing. And so what we've tried to do is to hold up those people. We've produced some videos that have highlighted some industry leaders on fair housing and how they're doing well by following the law and creating diverse and inclusive communities. Because the big question always is, why do folks still engage in discrimination? What are they getting out of it? And the people who don't engage in discrimination are probably best positioned to speak to those folks and tell them it doesn't pay. And so we've done these kinds of videos. We're actually doing a series more with both real estate leaders as well as people who've experienced discrimination to help people appreciate how it plays out, the impacts of it, and why it doesn't pay. We've also dug into this whole issue of schools because often the discussion of schools is a proxy for the discussion of the racial composition of communities. There's lots of misinformation spread about schools, misperceptions about schools, and sometimes limited information about schools. And invariably, people may be steered. What we saw in the Long Island Newsday clips were discussions about schools where some schools were disparaged, and those statements may have been made to white home seekers, but not necessarily to people of color. So it's interesting that schools can be framed as good or bad, but often different based on the racial composition or the racial background of the consumer. And so it's out there, and we said we need to sort of unpack this, and we've been working with education experts like Richard Rothstein, whose work on fair housing, and the color of law came about from the work that he was doing in addressing school segregation, much like Dr. King talked about. And we are working with him and some other education experts to try to unpack these issues and figure out ways that real estate agents can talk accurately and helpfully about schools without perpetuating segregation. As one example, we produced a video with a foundation out in California that had been working with the Pasadena Real Estate Association. It's called the Pasadena Foothills Association of Realtors, and an educational foundation on schools out there, because for a long time the Pasadena real estate agents were telling people, you don't want to go to the schools here. If you move here, put your kids in private schools. The schools are no good. And of course, there was a large minority population also in those schools. And the Pasadena school district was getting quite upset that the real estate profession was maligning the schools. And they encouraged the real estate profession to, come and actually take a look at the schools, spend some time in the schools. The real estate agents didn't really know the schools. And as the real estate agents got more actively involved in the schools, even coming in to participate in reading programs and other activities, they realized they really like the schools and that the schools have a lot to offer. And so they formed a partnership between the real estate professionals, the Pasadena Foothills Association of Realtors, and the school district and an educational foundation to share more information about the schools and true, accurate information about the schools. So in that respect, realtors have been leaders out there in California in trying to address the schools and housing issue that out there was limiting opportunities for people. So we created a video about that, and that's also available on our website. But those are the kinds of areas that we want to do more work in. And then finally, accountability. And I sort of view this as kind of the hard science aspect of all of this. People need deterrence, and the Fair Housing Law, while it's been there for the Federal Fair Housing Act, law, been enforced for 54 years this year. Clearly, discrimination still occurs. And we at the National Association of Realtors have made it clear that we don't want people who engage in discrimination among our ranks. And so we do want strong enforcement of the fair housing laws, and we have advocated for strong enforcement of the fair housing laws. We have supported fair housing testing. The the way in which private fair housing groups identify fair housing violations in communities. And the fact that discrimination persists is because there really isn't a whole lot of enforcement there. Certainly not much. It's a very reactive process where the government investigates complaints when people happen to learn or suspect that they're facing discrimination, but often consumers don't know because there isn't that kind of testing evidence that reveals it, as we all know, in a very powerful way. So that's very important. So we have supported that. But we've also said at the state level, there's a lot of variation in terms of enforcement of the real estate licensing laws when it comes to fair housing violations. Not only that, in many states, there just aren't strong provisions regarding fair housing in real estate licensing law. Whether it is for education or for discipline. And so we undertook a review of the state laws across all the states and U.S. territories to look at, what's in them. I'll have you know that New York was always stronger than many states, and now much stronger than many states when it comes to both education requirements and the discipline requirements. So there's a real range out there. And I was actually talking to some licensing officials recently. I won't say what states they were in, but when I was telling them about this review, they were saying, well, when discrimination occurs, there's not much that we can do with respect to someone's license. I'm like, what do you mean? And they're like, well, we don't do that. There's a state fair housing agency or HUD. They're the ones who do the review and determine whether discrimination occurs. But they're saying that if a judge ultimately finds someone has engaged even in the most egregious discrimination, the state doesn't do anything with respect to their license. And they're like, yeah. And sure enough, I looked at this particular state and I'm like, yeah, nothing happens. They don't have anything in the law. And there might be an education requirement, but even in many states, the education requirement is kind of like mixed in with others, and it's not clear that you would even have to have specific hours on fair housing, on fair housing specifically. And so when people say they don't engage in discrimination because they may lose their license, in many states that's just not true. It's just they wouldn't. And so we're working with our state association executives to help them better understand the licensing laws in their states and how they compare with other states. We've actually created a map and a whole tracker for state associations to look at, so they can see examples of what other states have done, and if they decide they want to work with their state legislatures to strengthen their laws, they have some examples and can do that. So there is great variation, and I know that New York State has been going gangbusters on fair housing laws and fair housing requirements, both in terms of the actual laws and the regulation. Just know that there's some parts of this country where there's very, very little. So you should be proud of the progress that you're making in New York State. So that is at the exclamation point and some of the things we're doing. Let me just say one more thing on the accountability part. We have launched a self-testing program. We announced in January 2020 that we would do this, that we would create a program where brokerages could basically come to NAR and say, I want to be tested. I want to see what my agents are doing and get a report so I can do something about it. This was for the brokerage, not for enforcement purposes. And it took quite a while for us to get that going, but we have created this program, and we're now piloting it. And we have brokerages who volunteered to be part of this. And yeah, what we hope to do is, one of the brokers that we're talking to, they're like, I'm sure there are problems. I don't doubt that there are, but the goal is, when they get that report, they will then also get training, and so this will all be in-house, a report provided to that brokerage, and then training to address the specific issues that occur. And I think that's a very proactive way for a company to get ahead of these issues. And I think it actually is helpful should someone ever out there file some complaint. There's not a lot of litigation on fair housing, believe it or not, but should someone file a complaint, I think it's actually going to be helpful if that brokerage has done some work behind this, and it'll be mitigating. So many people missed that announcement in January 2020, and then somehow, I think maybe during the racial reckoning, we mentioned it again, and it was remarkable how many more brokerages had realized this and said they want to participate. So now we actually have quite a number of brokerages who want to do this work to get right by the fair housing laws. So I'm pleased, because if we can hold ourselves accountable, there won't have to be Newsday stories. There won't have to be Department of Justice enforcement. We can lead and address these issues ourselves. So I described all of this stuff in ACT as sort of the basics. We shouldn't be engaged in discrimination, period. The fair housing laws should have corrected that, or forced us to correct that. But that is sort of the least we can do. It's kind of what I say, do no harm. So much harm has been done over 80 plus years that we also need to recognize that that harm is still affecting our housing market. The fact that many people have less resources to draw on when it comes to a down payment, the fact that many people's credit is more challenged than others. So many issues that we see when people apply for loans or go to purchase a property is the result of years of exclusion, of segregation, of devaluation of property, that it makes it very, very hard to close the home ownership gap between racial groups. So going into the pandemic, the home ownership gap between white Americans, and I'll use as an example Black Americans, is 30 percentage points. There are gaps in home ownership between white Americans and Asian Americans, gaps between white Americans and Hispanic Americans as well, significant gaps. But this one between whites and blacks is the largest, 30 percentage points. And what's fascinating, and I think perhaps illustrative of the problem we have to overcome, is that when you look at people who are successful homeowners, people who have purchased in the past year, take 20, well, we're now in 2022, but I looked at purchasers in 2020. African Americans, for example, were about 6% of purchasers. So, significantly less than their representation in the general public. But when you look at the details of those purchasers, what I found is African Americans have to do a whole lot more to qualify. So by that I mean, I looked at the education level of African Americans who purchase homes versus whites who purchase homes. African Americans who are successful in purchasing homes have significantly more education than white Americans. And why is that? Well, because in order to have higher income to purchase a home, you need significantly more education. You would think it would be equal, but the African American home purchaser needs that income to compensate for lack of family wealth, lack of resources. So when you also look at the purchasers in 2020, you saw that 3 times as many white purchasers were relying on equity from the sale of an existing home to purchase that home, versus African Americans. They didn't have that equity from a previous home. But you can take that through to everything. I mean, to even credit qualifications. Just not having those resources in your family, or not having the income in your family, and the homes valued at higher amounts meant often that to pay the same bills, you had less money, so your credit was stretched more. And so, in all these factors, we're seeing that in order to try to close the home ownership gap, we've got to recognize that the downstream effects of practices going back to the 20s and 30s are still hobbling us. That African Americans have to get still even more education, more income in order to qualify. And another complicating factor is student loans. And African Americans have significantly more student loans, which is also then in turn affecting their credit. And then there's some predatory student loans out there. And my expectation, my glum expectation, is that we're actually going to see the homeownership gap widen coming out of this pandemic. And I think student loan debt is going to contribute significantly to it, but also the loss of jobs, loss of income as a result of the pandemic. So here we are 54 years past the passage of the Fair Housing Act, when we all would expect that home ownership gaps would close. And by the way, they had closed some, but in the downturn, the subprime meltdown of 20 years ago, 15 years ago, then started to open up another gap again. But yeah, I expect that we're probably going to see this gap widen, unfortunately, unless we take some steps. And that's why NAR has been working with others to take a close look at what can we do, what should we be doing. One thing that we know is we still have a problem with appraisals, that we are still seeing significant gaps in appraisals for comparable homes in different areas. Now, there are legitimate criteria that may result in two apparently comparable homes having different values in different neighborhoods. But some of the research that folks have done, including research done by Freddie Mac, suggests that when you factor out those things, there are still problems, that there appear to be some practices which are resulting in appraisal differences. Just one example, Freddie Mac found that when appraisals were done in African American communities, the comps that were drawn tightly around the house, whereas when appraisals that were done in white communities, on average, tended to draw from twice as large an area, which means you got twice as many comps to consider, which increases the likelihood of comps that might support the sale price. So those kinds of things they're noting. But then, of course, we're observing that homes occupied by African Americans in the same neighborhoods as whites are sometimes appraised lower. And you've probably seen some of the high-profile news stories over the last several years calling attention to that, often involving biracial couples. We saw a number of these cases involving biracial couples where when the African American spouse is home, they get one appraised value, and then when they call for a reappraisal and the African American spouse leaves and they remove pictures that indicate that an African American or African American family members live there, the appraisal jumps. And I've seen 3 stories of this kind in the past year and a half like this, where the appraisal jumped by 40 to 50%. So we are rolling up our sleeves at NAR to work with partners to address this. HUD has created a task force. It's actually an all-of-government task force. A number of governmental agencies are part of this. And we have engaged them to discuss these issues. And we continue to do that. And we've had a work group between our Fair Housing Committee and our Real Property Valuation Committee to look at these issues. So this is key because it means that even when we succeed in creating home ownership, people of color may not be getting the full value of home ownership. And that leads to all these other issues I've described, not having the money that you should have to qualify for other things. And so we have to get on top of that. We're part of something called the Black Home Ownership Collaborative, where we're working with the Mortgage Bankers Association, who've been great leaders on these issues, as well as the Urban League and the National Fair Housing Alliance, NAREB, and others, to support a raft of things that could help. We supported down payment assistance. There was down payment assistance in the Build Back Better bill before Congress that we supported. We're also talking about looking at alternative credit. We all know that your rent and your utilities is not traditionally included in your credit. Fannie Mae and others are pioneering work to see that it is, so that if you've been paying rent for 15, 20 years and paying that on time and your utilities, that can help boost your credit score. And then we're also looking at what we can do in terms of addressing student loans. We're not calling for student loan cancellation, but we are trying to look at this issue and sort of anticipate how it's going to affect creditworthiness, really of all borrowers, but with an acute impact on borrowers of color. And looking at, just what partnerships we can make with other institutions to address this, because we are concerned that there is some predatory lending out there as well when it comes to education loans. So there's a lot, but I say all of this to stress that it's not just about what the agent does. At the bare minimum, we need to make sure things don't get worse, and that we stamp out discrimination in our marketplace. But beyond that, associations, whether they be local associations or NAR, play a role in advocating for other change and for recognizing how a history of exclusion, a history of discrimination, lack of opportunity still affects the marketplace today, and that we can look for creative, thoughtful, and fair change to address that. So I'm going to leave it right there. I see we've got about 12 minutes left. I would love to take questions if we have that chance. And maybe, Patrick, I'll say something more about Summer of Soul if you'd like.
Yeah, great. Well, I guess I don't see any questions in the chat, and I didn't connect with you before you were going to give this presentation, so I wasn't sure if you were going to be more historical and retrospective or prospective. And I'm glad you kind of answered the main question I had, which was, Dr. King was 39 years old when he was assassinated, which is hard to believe. He was that young, but he would have been 92 years old today if he were still alive, which is I think still a pretty attainable age. And I guess my question before knowing exactly what you were going to present was, if he were alive today, what do you think he would be advocating for? What causes do you think that he would be taking up? But I think you really hit most of it in what you covered today, and I'm glad you did. But I don't know, beyond what you covered with respect to housing, what other issues, if any, do you think he would be looking at today if he were still alive? Because that struggle for inequality is still obviously a struggle that continues today, and I think he'd be looking to try to resolve.
Yeah, I think he would be looking. I think housing would be very central because it kind of how life is organized, and I think he himself, I think sort of powerfully began to realize that towards the end of his life. I think he'd also be concerned about education, and when I say education, sort of knowing our history. As you noted that I've been writing a lot about history. And I just think history is just kind of always illuminating because it helps you realize that some of these problems we're dealing with are not old. Sorry, not new. They're old, and that it helps to sort of figure out what animates them. What animates them. And I think, even when I listened to this interview I mentioned from Dr. King, that he was really sort of reaching back in history and just saying, America's not willing to deal with some of the core issues that really, were created by the Constitution itself, right? And so King seemed to really appreciate that and recognize that. And so I think if he were alive today, he would challenge us to say, don't think that just because you've changed laws that you have changed the American mind. Look at how we live and look at how we have lived, and try to understand that. Try to understand, what's motivating us. And that's why I say, even with our housing work, the cultural component in some ways is really the tough work. Trying to figure out why when people are faced with equally qualified or even better qualified candidates of a particular background, do they still prefer someone else? Like, what's going on there? And I think you have to understand, not just the mind of an individual, but the culture as a whole.
Okay. Well, I'm glad you covered going forward, because I think that struggle continues, and it's certainly one that all of us need to work towards trying to resolve. I guess if I don't see any other questions, but yeah, if you want to touch more on Summer of Soul, I know it's Hulu, right? It's available on Hulu.
Yeah, it is.
Talk a little bit more about what I'm curious, what brought you into the project, and maybe tell everybody out there a little bit more about it so that they are enticed to go check it out.
Sure. And what I'm going to do right now is I'm posting into the chat this television interview with Dr. King. It's about 27 minutes, and I just highly commend it to everybody. I don't know if you haven't seen it, you probably have never seen Dr. King presenting on like a news program like this before. And he's standing in Ebenezer Baptist Church with stained glass windows behind him, but he's just standing there talking to a news reporter. It's really good. So in terms of Summer of Soul, it really is directly relevant to some of our work here. I got into this, and this is a fascinating thing when I consider what it's become. I was just kind of, at my dining room table Googling. And what I was Googling about was actually New York City Mayor John Lindsay. And I had remembered, and actually my father was still alive at that time. My father died in 2017. So this would have been 2017. But my father, had often talked about his admiration for Mayor Lindsay. And I just, didn't know much about him. And, my father was sort of traditional Democrat, and Mayor Lindsay I knew was a Republican. I was kind of curious, what it was about Lindsay that attracted my father. And, he described him as sort of this Kennedy-esque figure. And, I had heard quite a bit about Lindsay being a champion for civil rights. And so I was just Googling to find out more information about him. And in the course of that, I came across a story that said that he was invited onto stage at a Harlem festival where he was introduced as our blue-eyed soul brother working for us downtown. And I was just like, what is this? Like, how does this come about? What mayor gets introduced that way? And so then I just started to read more, and I was specifically reading about Mayor Lindsay's work in the parks, in New York City parks, and encouraging their use and getting people of all backgrounds into the parks and trying to create more life in the parks and strengthen the parks. But then also, this was sort of the era of like Head Start and other uplift programs. And so I kind of went in sort of looking at that and trying to sort of understand that. And then when I saw references to this festival, and there was a lot of misinformation out there. They said it was in Central Park. Other places said it was in a smaller park. And then, I saw the names of the performers, and I said, does anyone know about this? And so I began, I posted on Facebook about it. I found some pictures and I posted about it, and someone said, you ought to write something about this. And that's what I did. I wrote a story in 2017 in a small journal, and people started to pay attention to it. And the fellow who had filmed the festival died that year. And in the obituary, I saw that some people were trying to get access to this film that he had filmed, but that he could never, get anyone interested in doing anything with. And so I reached out to the Hollywood producers and I said, I've written the most comprehensive account of this festival, and it's a quite comprehensive account I wrote. And so we just started talking, and they said, you should consult on this. And so they brought me in, and I helped out with the film. Spent a lot of time up in New York in editing suites and, in planning rooms, and then did a lot of additional research to help track down people who had gone to this festival. But yeah, we brought out, I thought, a lot of interesting themes of what was going on in America and what was going on in the Black community at that time. And then also, presented some great music.
Yeah, I mean the film. I'll admit I haven't watched it yet. I got to figure out the password for my kids for Hulu, but I did see the preview for it. I saw an interview you did on it, and that had some of the from the video, and it was. I mean, it's incredible.
Yeah,
it really is.
Well, I'm just amazed because when I was working on this, my wife thought like I was wasting my time. She thought, well, yeah, some people might find this really interesting, but like it seems like it's gonna be like very esoteric. And then it won Sundance, and now shortlisted for the Oscars. So so I'm actually pleased to have had a part in it.
Well, I hope to check it out this weekend. That's on my my to-do list. So
well, thanks for bringing it up.
Yeah, no, I think it's pieces of history like that get kind of underreported. It's certainly important to bring them to light, and the music was incredible. I mean, at least just what I saw. I was really impressed with the quality of the footage too. I'm sure it was all remastered, and that took a lot of work.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, really looks like an incredible piece. So I can't wait to check it out.
Well, thanks. So, well, thanks for having me and giving me opportunity to talk about it too.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that's it. I don't see any other questions. Bryan, thank you again for being here, and we certainly hope to have you back in the not too distant future.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks, Patrick. Thanks, Marianne. Say hi to Tessa for me.
Will do. Thanks a lot, Bryan. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.